October 12, 1944, outside the fortress city of Metz, an American infantry company is pinned in a muddy drainage ditch. In the open space between the lines, Corporal Vincent Perez lies wounded. 22-year-old medic Daniel Marsh checks the bright red cross on his armband and sprints into the kill zone. A concealed German sniper tracks his movement. The sniper has clear shots at several armed riflemen, but he holds his fire. He waits until Marsh is halfway across the field. Then, he pulls the trigger. The bullet drops Marsh in the mud, right next to the man he was trying to save. Despite the severe wound to his thigh, Marsh refuses to stay down. Gasping in the cold mud, he drags himself the final few yards to Perez. Ignoring his own bleeding, he pulls a tourniquet from his kit and secures it around the corporal's leg. Seeing both men now pinned and helpless in the open, a second medic, Arthur Donnelly, makes a desperate decision. He breaks from the cover of the ruined stone wall, sprinting toward his brothers. Instantly, the distinct crack of a Mauser rifle echoes across the field. A high-velocity bullet tears through the air, missing Donnelly's head by mere inches and showering him with shattered stone and wet earth. He dives into the dirt, entirely suppressed. This was not a panicked defender firing blindly into the autumn mist, nor a random exchange of crossfire. It was a calculated, incredibly patient ambush. The shooter had a clear view of the ditch and the American infantrymen returning fire. He had armed targets everywhere. Why was a highly trained German sniper deliberately ignoring combatants with rifles, choosing instead to wait in absolute silence specifically for unarmed men marked by the Red Cross? This was no isolated rogue marksman. It was the execution of a ruthless psychological tactic deployed against the U.S. Third Army, designed to shatter troop morale by turning medical aid into a fatal trap. This is the story of how those agonizing field reports reached General George S. Patton, triggering a massive, calculated military response to tear that system apart from the top down. To understand how the battlefield devolved into a place where the Red Cross was treated as a bullseye, you have to understand the brick wall the United States Third Army had just slammed into. Throughout the late summer of 1944, General George S. Patton's forces had executed one of the most brilliant armored pursuits in military history. Following the breakout from the Normandy beachheads, American mechanized columns tore across the French countryside with unprecedented speed. This was exactly the kind of war the Americans were built to fight: high velocity, aggressive maneuvering, bypassing strong points, and keeping the German military in a constant, chaotic state of retreat. Tanks, half-tracks, and motorized infantry routinely covered dozens of miles in a single day. The momentum felt absolute and unstoppable, fueling a widespread belief among the troops that the war might actually be over by Christmas. But by late September, that rapid advance began to choke on its own success. Supply lines, stretching perilously thin all the way back to the invasion beaches and the captured deep-water ports, were strained to the absolute breaking point. Gasoline shortages slowed the thirsty Sherman tanks to a crawl, and then the weather turned. The dry, dusty roads of late summer dissolved under the relentless, freezing downpours of the Lorraine autumn. The sweeping, triumphant offensive sank into deep, heavy mud. But deteriorating weather and stretched logistics were only the beginning of the tactical nightmare waiting in eastern France. Looming ahead of the exhausted American forces was the city of Metz. Situated strategically along the banks of the Moselle River, Metz was not just a provincial city, it was one of the most heavily fortified positions in all of Western Europe. Its geography and architecture made it a natural fortress, a place that had not been successfully taken by direct, hostile assault since the year 1552. The German High Command recognized its critical strategic value as the last major geographic gateway to the Saarland and the German homeland itself, and they reinforced it heavily. Metz was ringed by a massive, interconnected network of over 40 distinct fortresses. These were not hastily dug trenches, temporary earthworks, or makeshift wooden bunkers. These were colossal, permanent structures engineered from reinforced concrete and thick armor plate, embedded deep into the rolling hills and dense forests surrounding the city. Forts with names like Drian, Jeanne d'Arc, and Plappeville featured thick steel domes that could withstand direct hits from heavy artillery, vast subterranean tunnel systems that housed thousands of troops safe from aerial bombardment, and heavy gun batteries designed to coordinate overlapping fields of fire across every possible approach route. The American military doctrine relied heavily on air superiority and fast-moving armor to outflank and isolate the enemy. At Metz, flanking was physically impossible. The steep river valleys, the dense autumn forests, and the unyielding concrete fortresses funneled the advancing Third Army straight into pre-sighted kill zones. The entire nature of the war shifted violently in a matter of weeks. The high-speed, exhilarating armored sweeps of August were entirely replaced by a grinding, claustrophobic siege in October. American mobility, their absolute greatest tactical advantage, was completely neutralized by the thick concrete walls and the endless ocean of freezing mud. Tanks slid off flooded dirt roads, throwing their steel tracks and becoming easy, stationary targets for concealed German anti-tank guns. As the armor stalled, the brutal burden of the war fell squarely onto the shoulders of the frontline infantry. Divisions that had spent the summer aggressively chasing a retreating enemy across open fields now found themselves fighting a miserable, static war of attrition. It was a brutal reality that felt far more like the trench-bound horrors of 1918 than the highly mobile, modern, mechanized combat of 1944. Soldiers spent their days and nights submerged in freezing water, shivering in shallow, mud-filled foxholes, and inching their way forward, yard by bloody yard, through thick belts of barbed wire, unmarked minefields, and flooded ravines. The physical toll on the human body was staggering. Trench foot, pneumonia, and sheer exposure began claiming almost as many men on the line as enemy shrapnel. But the psychological toll of this stalemate was even worse. The Third Army was pinned down. The intoxicating momentum of the summer was completely gone, replaced by a deep, freezing exhaustion. Every small stone farmhouse, every ruined bridge, and every muddy drainage ditch became a bitter, drawn-out contest of basic survival. Inside the massive fortresses and the entrenched defensive positions surrounding the city, the German commanders understood this shift in tactical dynamics perfectly. The defending garrison at Metz was a complex, unpredictable mixture of elite military academy cadets, battle-hardened veterans transferred directly from the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, and newly conscripted replacements fighting desperately to keep the Americans out of Germany. The German leadership knew they could not defeat Patton's forces in an open, mobile battle of maneuver. But here, deeply entrenched in miles of concrete and steel, they did not have to. Their strategic objective was simply to hold the line, delay the Allied push toward the Rhine River, and bleed the American infantry units until their combat effectiveness completely collapsed. In a static, positional war, the advantage heavily favors a well-supplied defender. Without the chaos and confusion of a rapid retreat, German officers had the luxury of time. They meticulously mapped out the local terrain, calculated exact ranging coordinates for their mortars and artillery, and positioned their most lethal assets, including highly trained marksmen, with absolute deadly precision. They knew precisely where the advancing Americans would be forced to take cover, where their supply and evacuation routes were bottlenecked, and exactly how to inflict the maximum amount of pain on a stalled force. As the siege dragged painfully into mid-October, the fighting devolved into a ruthless, intimate struggle in the mud. The sheer desperation of the stalemate forced the defenders to look beyond standard, conventional military tactics. If they could not break the thick armor of the American tanks, they would have to find a way to break the American infantrymen's fundamental will to fight. They needed a method to shatter the psychological foundation of the frontline units, to make the already miserable conditions of the Lorraine autumn completely unbearable. In this grinding, claustrophobic environment, the enemy sought new, calculated methods to spread terror, turning the static battlefield into a psychological meat grinder where human compassion itself would be weaponized. The shift in how this invisible war was fought did not begin in a grand briefing room or inside a general's canvas headquarters. It began in the freezing mud of that drainage ditch, where Sergeant Hugh Carver pulled a sodden, graphite-stained field notebook from inside his wool jacket. With his squad still pinned flat under the shadow of the ruined stone wall, Carver did not scream orders or blindly hurl hand grenades into the misty tree line. He focused on something far more dangerous to the man hidden in the brush: precise, methodical observation. Carver was an experienced, non-commissioned officer who knew that in the fog of war, terror thrives on ambiguity. When soldiers believe they are simply suffering under the random, cruel chaos of combat, panic sets in. But Carver began treating the bloody sequence of events not as an unfortunate tragedy, but as a forensic crime scene. While bullets still occasionally snapped over the ditch, he pressed his back against the wet earth, checked his wristwatch, and began writing. He logged the exact time, 14:15. He estimated the distance to the concealed firing position, approximately 300 yards, likely elevated in the upper floor of a damaged barn near the tree line. Then he meticulously mapped out the exact timeline and sequence of every single round fired. First came the initial contact, a brief volley of rifle fire that wounded Corporal Perez. At that moment, at least 4 armed American riflemen, including Carver himself, were partially exposed along the lip of the embankment. They were static, clear targets for any trained marksman. The sniper took none of them. Instead, the shooter held his fire for nearly 3 full minutes. He waited silently until medic Daniel Marsh stepped into the open. Marsh was wearing a pristine white helmet painted with bold red crosses, along with a bright armband. There was no possible way to mistake him for an infantryman carrying an M1 Garand. Yet the sniper waited until Marsh reached the exact center of the open ground, where cover was impossible, before placing a single, deliberate round into his leg. When medic Arthur Donnelly broke cover to assist, the pattern repeated itself instantly. A second bullet cracked through the air, aimed directly at the second clearly marked medic. Carver stared at his notes in the dim autumn light. The cold arithmetic on the wet paper was undeniable. This was not a panicked conscript spraying bullets at movement in the fog. It was an exceptionally disciplined, patient shooter who had deliberately bypassed several easy kills on armed combatants in order to bait and neutralize the unit's medical personnel. As the rain began to smudge the fresh lead marks on the page, Sergeant Carver realized the sheer weight of what he was holding. If this was just one rogue soldier breaking the rules of engagement, it was a local tragedy. But if this cold-blooded patience was being repeated across the sector, it meant the enemy had found a terrifying new vulnerability in the Third Army's lines. Carver folded the notebook, tucked it securely into his waterproof coat pocket, and signaled his runner. This document was no longer just an after-action report for a company captain. It was a concrete piece of tactical intelligence that was about to travel straight up the chain of command, raising a terrifying question. How many other ditches in Lorraine were witnessing the exact same pattern? The answer to that terrifying question began to materialize as Sergeant Carver's sodden notebook moved beyond the mud of the company command post. His handwritten forensic timeline bypassed the chaotic shouting of the frontline foxholes and was handed off to a runner who crawled through the freezing slurry of a flooded communication trench to deliver it to the rear. Tucked inside a wool shirt and wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas to protect it from the relentless Lorraine rain, that small, damp piece of paper carried an invisible, heavy weight. It traveled a mile behind the lines, finally reaching the battalion command post, situated in the damp, reinforced cellar of a shattered French farmhouse. Down in the darkness, illuminated only by hooded kerosene lanterns and the glow of cigarettes, the battalion intelligence section, the S2, was operating in a state of perpetual, grinding exhaustion. The atmosphere inside the S2 cellar was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale coffee, and ozone. Intelligence officers, bleary-eyed from days of plotting grid coordinates, tracking enemy artillery patterns on acetate-covered maps, and deciphering intercepted radio traffic, received Carver's notes. Under normal circumstances in the brutal autumn of 1944, a frontline report of a sniper shooting a medic might have easily been dismissed by the chain of command as a tragic yet inevitable accident of close-quarters combat. The fog of war is thick, stray bullets find unintended targets, mud-splattered armbands are easily obscured in the morning mist, and the chaotic geometry of a firefight rarely allows for perfect target identification. Furthermore, intelligence officers knew that men suffering from severe battle fatigue frequently reported seeing targeted malice in what was actually just the blind, indiscriminate violence of an artillery barrage or a panicked machine gun burst. There is a constant bureaucratic friction in military intelligence, a natural tendency to filter out the emotional trauma of the infantryman to find the cold, hard, tactical reality. But Sergeant Carver's notes were not the frantic, exaggerated scribblings of a panicked soldier suffering from shell shock. They were a meticulous forensic reconstruction of a crime scene. A young intelligence lieutenant, reading the report under the harsh glare of a flashlight, immediately recognized the clinical, methodological precision in Carver's handwriting. He read the exact timestamps, the estimated yardage to the tree line, and the clinical breakdown of the ambush sequence. He noted the initial volley that dropped Corporal Perez, the agonizing 3-minute pause where the battlefield fell dead silent, the clear availability of armed American targets partially exposed on the lip of the ditch, and the deliberate, calculated restraint shown by the concealed German marksman. The sniper had waited in absolute silence, ignoring men with M1 Garand rifles, until medic Daniel Marsh, clearly marked with a bright red cross and completely unarmed, was exposed in the exact center of the kill zone. And then, the immediate precision targeting of a second medic, Arthur Donnelly, the exact fraction of a second he broke cover to assist. This was not the random spray of a panicked conscript firing blindly into the fog. This was a calculated equation of risk and reward, executed by a highly disciplined specialist who possessed total fire control. Tracing a grease pencil across a topographical map of the Metz perimeter, the intelligence lieutenant felt a sudden, cold sense of recognition. The methodology described in Carver's muddy notebook felt far too deliberate, far too specific, to be an isolated anomaly born out of one rogue soldier's cruelty. Seeking confirmation, he turned to the wooden filing cabinets holding the week's dispatch logs and after-action reports from the broader 10th Corps sector. Shuffling through the carbon-copied combat summaries, casualty lists, and morning reports, he began pulling files from other American companies operating along the same miserable, flooded stretch of the front line. Within an hour, a terrifying, undeniable pattern materialized on the wooden table. 2 days earlier, near the industrial ruins of Mézières-les-Metz, an infantry squad from a completely different regiment had been pinned down in a flooded ravine. According to their after-action report, a medic, carrying a bulky canvas medical kit and wearing a helmet painted with 4 bright red crosses, had attempted to low-crawl through the debris to reach a rifleman suffering from a severe shrapnel wound to the shoulder. A German sniper, heavily concealed in the twisted steel girders of a destroyed railway bridge, had entirely ignored 3 American machine gunners who were actively suppressing his general area. The sniper waited patiently, holding his fire until the medic knelt in the mud to apply a field dressing, and then put a single high-velocity round directly through the medic's chest. The armed machine gunners were left completely untouched. 24 hours after that incident, in a densely wooded, heavily mined sector just south of the massive Fort Drian, a stretcher-bearer team was attempting to evacuate a wounded lieutenant. They were moving deliberately behind the primary line of contact, clearly silhouetted against the morning fog, operating under the assumption that they were safely out of direct small arms range. A sniper, utilizing a scoped Mauser rifle from a highly elevated, camouflaged position in the pines, dropped the lead stretcher-bearer instantly. When the rear-bearer instinctively dropped his end of the canvas stretcher to grab his partner's webbing and pull him into the thick brush, a second round shattered the rear-bearer's knee. The wounded lieutenant, lying helpless on the dropped stretcher, was deliberately ignored. The intelligence officers laid the 3 reports side by side on the map table. The geographic coordinates were miles apart, involving entirely different American battalions and facing completely different German defensive elements, holding different sectors of the fortress ring. Yet, the tactical signature linking the 3 events was completely identical. Similar engagement ranges, identical target prioritization, the exact same terrifying, cold-blooded patience. This was not a rogue marksman seeking personal glory, nor was it a localized breakdown in the German chain of command. A lone psychotic soldier on the battlefield might commit an atrocity in one specific ditch, but 3 identical incidents, spanning multiple miles of entrenched front line within a tight 72-hour window, completely defied the mathematics of coincidence. It was a coordinated, grid-wide tactical shift. Someone, somewhere inside the vast, subterranean command bunkers of the Metz fortress system, had issued a standing order to fundamentally change the rules of engagement. The enemy had officially decided that the internationally recognized symbol of medical neutrality was no longer a shield, but a highly prioritized bullseye. The definitive proof of this systemic, top-down tactical shift arrived 3 days later, on October 15th, during a brutal, close-quarters trench-clearing operation on the muddy, heavily defended slopes leading up to one of the outer concrete redoubts. American infantrymen engaged in a vicious, grenade-heavy firefight. They managed to overwhelm a forward German defensive position, collapsing a bunker and taking a handful of prisoners. Among the exhausted, shell-shocked defenders dragged back through the barbed wire was a German Feldwebel, a senior non-commissioned officer from an elite, battle-hardened infantry regiment. He was covered in chalky concrete dust, freezing mud, and the blood of his unit, his uniform torn and soaked, but he retained the rigid, disciplined posture of a veteran who had survived years of relentless combat. He was immediately separated from the enlisted prisoners and transported to a division-level interrogation center set up in a requisitioned French schoolhouse, safely beyond the range of the German heavy mortars. American military intelligence interrogators, fluent in German and intimately familiar with the complex psychology of the opposing force, sat across from him in a stark, brightly lit classroom. They did not use physical force or screaming intimidation. Instead, they utilized the profound isolation of the room, the sudden psychological relief of being removed from the artillery barrage, the offer of hot coffee and rations, and a relentless methodical series of specific tactical questions designed to map out the command structure defending the forts. What the American interrogators slowly and carefully extracted from the Feldwebel over hours of precise questioning revealed a deeply unsettling reality about the collective mindset of the German command at Metz. From the outside, the massive fortress system looked impenetrable, a monolithic wall of unyielding concrete and steel. But inside those dark, damp, subterranean tunnels, a creeping, pervasive psychological panic was taking deep root among the defending officers. The German commanders knew that their standard defensive tactics, relying on interlocking fields of heavy machine gun fire, perfectly registered artillery barrages, and incredibly thick concrete walls, were inflicting terrible, bleeding casualties on the advancing Americans. But they also knew, with terrifying certainty, that these traditional methods were failing to permanently halt the American momentum. The Americans simply kept coming. They absorbed the horrific losses, dragged their dead and wounded out of the freezing mud, brought up endless columns of fresh replacements, fueled their idling tanks, and ground forward another bloody 100 yards. The sheer logistical weight, the massive industrial capacity, and the stubborn, relentless resilience of the U.S. Third Army was slowly, inevitably suffocating the defenders. The German command realized that they were trapped in a mathematical impossibility. They could not win a long-term battle of attrition against American manpower reserves. The Luftwaffe was absent from the skies, their own panzer divisions were desperately low on fuel, and resupply from the German homeland was becoming virtually impossible. If the fight remained purely a physical contest of artillery shells and concrete walls, the fortresses would eventually fall, overwhelmed by endless, grinding waves of men and steel. To hold the line and buy precious time for the defense of the German border, the sector commanders determined they desperately needed a new weapon. They needed an asymmetrical tactic that bypassed the thick physical armor of the Sherman tanks and struck directly, violently, at the psychological foundation of the attacking infantry. They needed a method that would make the miserable, freezing, disease-ridden conditions of the Lorraine autumn so profoundly unendurable that the individual American infantryman's fundamental will to advance would completely and utterly collapse. Sitting under the harsh glare of a bare incandescent bulb in the requisitioned schoolhouse, the captured Feldwebel finally broke the silence surrounding the orchestrated sniper operations. He spoke not with the screaming fanaticism of a political zealot, but with the cold, detached, almost clinical professionalism of a career soldier explaining a simple logistical equation. He confirmed the absolute worst fears of the American intelligence officers listening across the table. There was no misunderstanding on the battlefield. There was no breakdown in unit discipline. There was a specific, chilling, top-down directive handed down directly from the German sector command. The order was explicit and uncompromising. German designated marksmen, elite snipers, and forward observation posts were instructed to actively scan the chaotic battlefield specifically for the white armbands, the uniquely painted helmets, and the heavy canvas medical bags. They were officially ordered to prioritize American medics above all other targets of opportunity, regardless of the tactical situation. They were explicitly told to bypass infantry officers, to completely ignore radio men calling in devastating artillery coordinates, and to hold their fire on exposed heavy machine gunners. The unarmed men bearing the Red Cross were designated as the primary, high-value targets, and eliminating them was considered a paramount tactical objective. As the interrogators pressed the Feldwebel on the tactical and strategic reasoning behind such a blatant, systematic violation of the Geneva Conventions and the basic laws of armed conflict, the prisoner's explanation revealed a doctrine of psychological warfare so ruthless and calculating it momentarily silenced the room. The German command had coldly calculated the ripple effect of a single, well-placed bullet. If a concealed sniper fires and kills an American rifleman, the American Army loses one rifle. The unit takes a single casualty. The squad's medic treats him, stabilizes him, calls for evacuation, and the rest of the squad continues to fight, maintaining their forward momentum. It is a linear, mathematically predictable loss that an army of millions can easily absorb. But if that same sniper holds his fire, waits, and kills the medic instead, the mathematics of the battlefield fundamentally change, expanding into an exponential catastrophe for the attacking unit. Eliminating the medic guarantees that the wounded rifleman bleeding out in the mud will likely die from a lack of immediate professional care. It guarantees that the next man in the platoon who takes a piece of shrapnel to the abdomen will also bleed to death. But far more importantly, it turns the wounded men into an agonizing, highly effective psychological weapon against their own squad. When a medic is neutralized in the center of a kill zone, the surviving infantrymen pinned down in the mud are forced to listen to the screams, the pleading, and the slow fading of their dying friends, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that no professional medical help is coming. The profound psychological trauma of watching a comrade slowly bleed to death because the one man highly trained to save him is lying dead beside him destroys unit cohesion and morale faster and far more permanently than any heavy artillery barrage. The cold logic of the German directive went even deeper, striking directly at the very core of why men are willing to charge into deadly enemy fire in the first place. The fundamental, unwritten contract of the frontline infantrymen is built on a specific, powerful, unspoken trust. If you fall in combat, your brothers will come for you. If you are torn apart by artillery shrapnel or hit by machine gun fire, a medic will brave the incoming fire, drag you to the safety of a crater, apply a tourniquet, administer morphine, and ensure you make it home. That profound psychological trust is the invisible armor that allows a terrified young man to stand up in a freezing, waterlogged ditch and run straight toward a fortified concrete machine gun nest. The German Sector Command's directive was meticulously, surgically designed to shatter that invisible armor into a million pieces. By consciously waiting for the medics to expose themselves in the open, the enemy was turning the universal symbol of the Red Cross into a highly effective, fatal lure. They were explicitly weaponizing the fundamental, decent human instinct to save a fallen comrade. The American intelligence officers in the schoolhouse realized they were no longer just dealing with the inherent cruelty of modern war. They were facing a highly calculated, institutionalized system of terror. The German command wanted the American troops to realize that calling out for a medic was effectively signing a death sentence for that medic. They wanted the bleeding infantrymen to hesitate before screaming for help in the dark. They wanted the surviving medics to hesitate, even for a fraction of a second, before running out into the open ground. That tiny fraction of a second of hesitation, that creeping doubt, multiplied across thousands of men on the freezing front line, would paralyze the forward momentum of the Third Army far more effectively than a wall of reinforced concrete. If an advancing infantry squad begins to believe that getting wounded means a slow, inevitable, agonizing death in the mud because the medical evacuation chain has been deliberately and systematically severed by enemy snipers, their willingness to execute aggressive offensive operations instantly evaporates. They stop taking necessary tactical risks. They stop moving forward. They freeze in their flooded foxholes, consumed by the terrifying, isolating realization that they are entirely alone on the battlefield, and that survival is no longer a shared effort. This was the true, ultimate objective of the German command: to permanently stall the American advance through sheer, paralyzing terror, turning the deeply ingrained American military culture of leaving no man behind into a fatal tactical vulnerability. The intelligence officers in the requisitioned schoolhouse worked furiously through the night, the rhythmic, mechanical clacking of their heavy typewriters echoing relentlessly down the empty hallways as they translated the Feldwebel's grim confession and meticulously cross-referenced his statements with the mounting pile of after-action reports. The seemingly isolated incident that Sergeant Carver had so carefully documented in his graphite-stained notebook was now the verified cornerstone of a sprawling, horrifying intelligence picture. The S2 analysts urgently consolidated the frontline field reports, the forensic timelines, the geographical data points, and the translated interrogation transcripts into a single, comprehensive, highly classified intelligence brief. This was no longer a minor issue requiring battalion-level tactical adjustments or a simple warning to frontline troops to keep their heads down. A localized war crime had been officially escalated into a formalized, systemic doctrine of psychological warfare that threatened to completely break the combat effectiveness and the psychological will of the entire infantry force surrounding Metz. The thick manila folder containing the consolidated intelligence report was stamped with the highest priority classification. It bypassed the standard, sluggish logistical channels and the usual bureaucratic delays of military paperwork. It was immediately handed to a motorized courier who drove relentlessly through the freezing rain, navigating past the bogged-down Sherman tanks, the endless convoys of supply trucks, and the exhausted columns of marching infantry, heading directly for the upper echelons of the 20th Corps and the command center of the U.S. Third Army. The American command structure was now racing against a systemic doctrine of terror. Every single hour the intelligence report spent in transit, another young medic with a bright red cross painted on his steel helmet was stepping out into the freezing mud, entirely unaware that he was the prioritized focal point of a sniper's crosshairs. A consolidated intelligence report detailing this orchestrated, calculated war crime was drafted and moving rapidly up the chain of command, destined for the highest desks in the military hierarchy. But how would the famously aggressive, highly volatile American High Command react to the undeniable proof of such a calculated, cold-blooded atrocity? On October 17th, that high-priority intelligence brief landed directly on the desk of General George S. Patton at Third Army headquarters. Patton was a commander celebrated and feared in equal measure for his volatile, highly dramatic temper. In the minds of both his subordinates and the American public, he was a man of explosive, visceral rage, someone expected to react to a blatant battlefield atrocity by pounding his fist on the map table, screaming profanities, and demanding immediate, blood-for-blood retribution. But the officers standing stiffly inside the headquarters room, waiting for the inevitable seismic detonation, witnessed something far more unsettling. There was no outburst, there was no theatrical rage. As Patton read through the translated interrogation transcripts and the forensic field timelines, the room fell into complete dead silence. For nearly 2 minutes, the general said nothing at all. He sat motionless, meticulously reading the documents a second time, tracing his finger along the grid coordinates where the sniper attacks had occurred. The volatile emotional fire that defined his public reputation completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, deeply unsettling silence. In those quiet moments, the reaction of the Third Army's commander underwent a fundamental shift from visceral, human anger to cold, mechanical calculation. Patton was not reading the report as a moral tragedy or a standard violation of international law. He was analyzing it through the lens of pure battlefield mathematics. He recognized instantly that this was not an isolated series of war crimes committed by rogue shooters, nor was it a random breakdown of discipline among the defending garrison. It was an organized, tactical doctrine, an asymmetrical weapon engineered specifically to break the psychological spine of his frontline infantry and freeze his stalled offensive in the mud. And because it was an organized military system, Patton realized that emotional outrage and formal diplomatic complaints through the Geneva Convention would be utterly useless. A system could not be protested. It had to be systematically, mathematically, dismantled from the top down. He set the report down on the table, looked up at his waiting staff, and began to speak. Not to condemn a war crime, but to order an operation. Patton did not shout. He looked up from the intelligence brief and immediately summoned Major General Walton Walker, the commander of the 20th Corps. Patton did not ask for a generalized counterattack or a vague increase in frontline patrols. He demanded absolute surgical precision. He wanted the exact name, the specific rank, and the precise unit designation of the German officer who had authorized the directive. Most importantly, he demanded the exact map coordinates of that sector commander's subterranean command post. Intelligence officers scrambled to cross-reference encrypted radio intercepts, prisoner interrogation logs, and aerial reconnaissance photographs. As the grid coordinates were finally locked in, Patton called in his chief of artillery. This was not going to be a blind, punitive bombardment, nor was it a scattered barrage of revenge. Retaliation implies an emotional loss of control. Instead, Patton explicitly framed the impending strike to his staff as a legitimate, devastating military operation. The enemy had weaponized a war crime to systematically degrade American medical logistics. Therefore, the command structure issuing that order was a high-priority tactical threat, and it was going to be physically severed from the battlefield. The full, terrifying weight of the United States Third Army was suddenly concentrated onto a highly specific geographic focal point: heavy 155mm long tom cannons and massive 8-inch howitzers, previously spread thin across the entire Metz perimeter, were rapidly relayed and synchronized. Their firing tables were adjusted to target the specific concrete redoubts sheltering the identified German headquarters and the surrounding elevated ridges harboring the suspected sniper nests. The resulting barrage was apocalyptic. Earth-shattering salvos of high-explosive shells slammed into the dense Lorraine forests and pounded the reinforced concrete roofs of the ancient forts. The American guns fired relentlessly, turning the targeted sector into a deafening, localized earthquake of shattered steel and pulverized stone. They weren't just trying to kill the individual marksman pulling the triggers, they were systematically collapsing the architecture of the command system that had put them there. Simultaneously, the order was passed down to the frontline rifle companies pinned in the freezing trenches. They were no longer told to just hold the line and survive. Forward infantry units were commanded to move aggressively, pushing out into the freezing rain to actively flush out the known firing positions. They were ordered to systematically deny the enemy snipers any safe haven, utilizing the devastating cover of the artillery barrage to close the distance and clear the tree lines with grenades and submachine guns. It was a desperate, violent race against the clock to crush the German command structure before the sun rose and more medics could be slaughtered in the mud. For hours, the localized bombardment tore the landscape apart, sending massive shockwaves echoing across the flooded river valleys. Then, as abruptly as the offensive had begun, the roaring thunder of the heavy American guns ceased. An eerie, ringing silence fell back over the battlefield. The heavy autumn rain began to wash the dust from the air, and thick gray smoke slowly cleared over the battered concrete forts of Metz. The designated command network had been pulverized, but as the American infantry cautiously peered over the lips of their flooded ditches, looking out into the mist, a chilling uncertainty remained. Had the massive operational strike actually succeeded in breaking the system? The answer arrived not in a sudden surrender, but in the cautious days that followed the barrage. The systematic, calculated hunting of American medical personnel across the Metz perimeter ceased. The terrifying psychological weapon engineered to break the Third Army's infantry was completely shattered. But it was not defeated by a lone American marksman settling a score in a fictional, dramatic sniper duel. It was dismantled by the crushing, coordinated weight of combined arms intelligence and massive artillery fire. This immediate suppression proved something fundamental about the machinery of the American military in the autumn of 1944. The careful, objective observations of a single infantryman, Sergeant Hugh Carver, meticulously writing in a rain-soaked notebook while pinned in a drainage ditch, did not vanish into a bureaucratic void. His forensic timeline bypassed the chaos of the front line and drove the highest levels of military command to swift, decisive action. The grim reality of the Lorraine campaign exposed a sobering truth about the nature of international law in the middle of a total war. The bright red cross painted on a steel helmet or stitched onto a cotton armband possesses absolutely no physical power. Woven threads and white paint cannot deflect a high-velocity sniper bullet. Symbols of mercy only survive on a battlefield when they are actively backed by the absolute willingness to protect them with overwhelming, devastating force. The American command did not react to a war crime by abandoning the rules of engagement or ordering blind revenge. Instead, they delivered a terrifying, uncompromising tactical message directly into the subterranean bunkers of the enemy. The Army accepted that it could not physically stop every concealed shooter from pulling the trigger in the fog. However, it guaranteed that any command structure attempting to institutionalize that cruelty, any officer attempting to exploit the symbol of the Red Cross to turn compassion into a fatal trap, would face immediate, localized destruction. It was a cold, necessary equation, born in the freezing mud, leaving one final, lingering reality about the limits of humanity under fire. The German defenders at Metz believed they had found a brilliant asymmetrical vulnerability, calculating that they could paralyze the advancing infantry by explicitly weaponizing the basic human compassion of the battlefield medic. But in their desperate attempt to use the act of medical mercy as a localized weapon of psychological fear, they fundamentally misunderstood the command structure they were facing. By deliberately severing the fragile lifeline of the frontline soldier, the enemy did not break the will of the Third Army, but only succeeded in drawing the full, merciless, and utterly unrestrained weight of the American military apparatus directly down upon their own heads.